Marissa loved to hike in the woods near her house. One day, she decided to explore a new trail that she had never taken before. As she walked, she noticed that the woods seemed unusually quiet. She couldn't hear the chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Marissa turned around, but no one was there. She started walking again, and the footsteps continued. She turned around again and saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, and he was walking towards her with a strange expression on his face. Feeling uneasy, Marissa quickened her pace. But the man continued to follow her. When she finally reached her car, Marissa turned around one last time, but the man had vanished. As she drove home, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. When she got home, she went straight to bed, exhausted from the hike. As she closed her eyes, she felt a hand reach out from under the bed and grab her ankle. Marissa tried to scream, but the hand tightened its grip. She tried to pull away, but it was no use. The hand started to pull her under the bed. In a panic, Marissa kicked and thrashed, trying to break free. Suddenly, the hand released her, and she fell to the floor. She quickly crawled out from under the bed and turned on the light. As she looked around her room, she realized that there was no one else there. But then she noticed that the window was open, and there were footprints on the windowsill. From that night on, Marissa never went hiking alone again, and she always made sure to lock her windows and doors before going to bed. Samantha had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion on the hill. It had been abandoned for years, and there were all sorts of rumors about what had happened to the family that used to live there. One day, Samantha decided to explore the mansion on her own. She climbed up the hill and crept through the overgrown gardens, making her way to the front door. Once inside, Samantha found that the mansion was even more beautiful than she had imagined. However, as she made her way through the rooms, she started to feel like she was being watched. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from upstairs. Samantha cautiously climbed the stairs, and when she reached the top, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. As she approached the figure, she realized that it was a young girl, no older than 10 years old. The girl was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and she had a haunted look in her eyes. The girl revealed to Samantha that her family had been brutally murdered by an unknown assailant, and that her spirit had been trapped in the mansion ever since. Samantha promised to help the girl find peace and solve the mystery of her family's murder. Together, they searched the mansion for clues, and eventually, they found a hidden room that had been sealed off for years. Inside, they found a diary that belonged to the girl's mother. The diary contained a chilling confession: the mother had murdered her own family in a fit of madness. With the mystery solved and the girl's spirit finally at peace, Samantha left the mansion, vowing to never forget the horrors that she had witnessed. There was a small, isolated village tucked away in a valley surrounded by dense forest. The villagers lived a simple life, relying on the land for food and resources. But every year, as the leaves began to turn red and yellow, a terrible tragedy would occur. One by one, the children of the village would disappear, taken by an unknown force in the night. The parents searched desperately, but no trace of the missing children could ever be found. As the years went by, the villagers began to fear the arrival of autumn, knowing that their children were not safe. Some tried to leave the village, but the forest was too dangerous to travel through alone. One year, a new family moved to the village with a young daughter. The parents were warned of the danger, but they were not afraid. They believed that they could protect their child. But when autumn came, their daughter vanished, just like the others. The parents searched and searched, but found nothing. Desperate to find their daughter, they turned to an old wise woman who lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of the forest. She told them of an ancient ritual that could bring their daughter back, but warned them that it came with a terrible price. Without hesitation, the parents agreed to do whatever it took to bring their daughter home. They followed the instructions given to them by the wise woman and performed the ritual. As they waited in anticipation, the ground beneath them began to shake. A dark fog descended upon the village, and the trees shook with a terrible force. Suddenly, the ground opened up, revealing a dark pit. From the pit emerged a hideous creature, with sharp teeth and long, bony fingers. It let out a terrible shriek and lunged towards the parents, who stood frozen in terror. As the creature dragged them down into the pit, the parents realized too late that the wise woman had not warned them of the true cost of the ritual, their souls. After staring in disbelief at the body of the woman, the protagonist realizes that the entire town is likely infected with the same strange illness. They race back to their car and speed away from the town, their heart racing as they wonder if they've been infected as well. As they drive, they begin to feel strange sensations in their body, as if something is crawling beneath their skin. Panic sets in as they realize that they too have been infected, and they may be doomed to suffer the same horrifying fate as the people of that small town. Desperate to find a cure, they begin to research everything they can about the strange illness, but it soon becomes clear that there is no cure, no hope. They are left to wonder what will become of them, and if anyone will ever find a way to stop the mysterious disease from spreading further. It had been a long, hard week for Lisa. The endless meetings and deadlines at work had left her feeling drained and exhausted. All she wanted to do was curl up in bed and forget the world for a while. But when she finally got home, she found that her apartment had been broken into. The place was a mess, with drawers pulled out and belongings strewn about haphazardly. She knew she had to call the police, but the thought of dealing with more stress and hassle made her feel like giving up. As she waited for the authorities to arrive, she heard a strange noise coming from the bedroom. Heart racing, she crept down the hallway, wondering if the intruder was still inside. When she pushed open the door, she was met with an even greater horror than she could have imagined. The room was empty, save for a strange, shadowy figure that seemed to be moving on its own. Lisa couldn't believe her eyes as the shadowy form took on the shape of her own body, moving and contorting in ways that were physically impossible. She realized that it was a manifestation of all the stress and anxiety that had built up inside her over the years. Petrified, she watched as the shadowy figure grew larger and more menacing, threatening to swallow her whole. It was only when Lisa was on the brink of giving up that she remembered something her therapist had told her, that the best way to fight anxiety and stress was to confront it head-on. With newfound courage, Lisa stepped forward and faced the shadowy figure, determined to take control of her own fears. In that moment, the creature began to shrink and fade away, leaving Lisa feeling stronger and more empowered than ever before. As she picked up the pieces of her broken life, Lisa knew that she still had a long road ahead of her, but she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Once there was a man named Jack who lived a normal life until one day he discovered he had the ability to ignite things with his bare hands. He could set anything ablaze, and he quickly learned to control his power, using it to his advantage. At first, Jack used his ability for good. He became a firefighter and saved countless lives. But as time went on, he realized he could use his power for more sinister purposes. He began robbing banks and setting fire to buildings for the thrill of it. The police soon caught on to Jack's crimes, but they could never catch him. He was too clever and always one step ahead. The media dubbed him the Pyro, and he became one of the most notorious criminals in the country. As Jack continued his reign of terror, he began to lose control of his powers. They became harder to control, and the flames grew hotter and more destructive. He soon found that he couldn't turn off his ability and was consumed by the flames he created. In the end, Jack burned himself alive, and his ashes were scattered into the wind. but some say that his power still lingers, and those who come into contact with his ashes can feel a burning sensation in their hands. The legend of the pyro lives on as a warning to those who seek to use their powers for evil. In the small town of Millfield, there was a legend that had been passed down for generations. The legend spoke of a mysterious entity that would emerge from the depths of the forest on the outskirts of town every few years. It was said to be a creature of pure darkness that preyed on the fears and anxieties of those it encountered. Many had gone on into the forest to search for the creature, but none had ever returned. The legend was largely dismissed as a mere folk tale, but as time passed, strange occurrences began to happen in Millfield. People reported waking up in the middle of the night to find the creature standing at the foot of their bed. Others claimed to have seen it lurking in the shadows, watching them from afar. As the sightings increased in frequency, so too did the unease of the townsfolk. One day, a young woman named Rachel decided to investigate the legend. She was a journalist who had recently moved to Millfield, and she saw this as the perfect opportunity to make a name for herself. Armed with a camera and a notebook, she ventured into the forest in search of the creature. As she made her way deeper into the forest, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. The woods were unnaturally quiet, and a thick fog had settled over the trees. Suddenly, she heard a rustling in the underbrush. She froze, unsure of what to do. Out of the mist emerged a creature that she could only describe as pure evil. It was humanoid in shape, but its skin was a sickly shade of grey, and its eyes were black pits of emptiness. Rachel tried to run, but the creature was too fast. It caught up to her and wrapped its long, bony fingers around her neck. Rachel's life flashed before her eyes. She had grown up in a dysfunctional home, had battled depression and anxiety for most of her life, and had just begun to find a sense of purpose in her work as a journalist. She felt a deep sense of regret, knowing that she would never have the chance to fully live out her potential. As she felt herself slipping away, she suddenly remembered the legend of the creature. With all the strength she had left, she summoned the courage to stare directly into its eyes. The creature recoiled, as if burned by the intensity of her gaze. Rachel used this opportunity to break free and run back towards town. She survived the encounter, but she was never the same again. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged victorious, but the memory of the creature haunted her for the rest of her days. She spent the rest of her life investigating the legend, hoping to find a way to vanquish the creature once and for all. But as she learned more, she began to realize that the creature was not the source of the town's troubles. It was merely a reflection of the dark, repressed emotions that lay buried deep within the hearts of the townsfolk. And until they could confront those emotions head-on, the creature would continue to haunt them. The dollmaker's creation. In the small town of Millfield, there was a dollmaker named Mr. Jenkins. He was famous for creating the most beautiful dolls, each one unique and exquisite in their own way. The dolls were so lifelike that some people even believed they had a soul. One day, a wealthy woman named Mrs. Devereaux visited Mr. Jenkins and commissioned him to make a doll that looked just like her daughter, who had died in a car accident. Mr. Jenkins accepted the commission and worked tirelessly to create the perfect doll for Mrs. Devereaux. As he worked on the doll, he noticed that it was different from any other doll he had ever made. It seemed to have a life of its own. Mr. Jenkins brushed it off as his imagination and continued his work. But strange things began to happen in the town. People reported seeing a little girl wandering the streets at night, dressed in a white dress and carrying a doll that looked just like her. They said that the doll's eyes seemed to follow them wherever they went. One day, a woman brought her young daughter to Mr. Jenkins' shop to buy a doll. As the girl looked around the shop, she suddenly pointed to the doll that Mr. Jenkins had made for Mrs. Devereaux and screamed, "That's the girl that visits me at night." Mr. Jenkins realized that the doll he had made for Mrs. Devereaux had somehow become possessed by the spirit of his deceased daughter. He tried to destroy the doll, but it seemed indestructible. As the days passed, more and more people in the town began to report seeing the little girl and her doll. Some even claimed that the doll could move on its own. Mr. Jenkins knew that he had to do something to stop the doll from causing any more harm. He went to Mrs. Devereaux's mansion and found the doll sitting in a room all by itself. He picked it up and took it outside, intending to destroy it once and for all. But as he lifted the doll, he felt a sharp pain in his chest and fell to the ground. When Mrs. Devereaux found him, he was already dead. The doll was gone, and no one in the town ever saw it again. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of a little girl's laughter coming from the woods, and that if you look closely, you can see a doll dressed in a white dress sitting under a tree.